Let's understand some of the most important primitives in Kubernetes, including pods, replication controllers, deployments, and services. Now, you take your application and then you Dockerize it. So the first step towards that is an image, building an image. You already know that. You take that image and you want to run that as a container. When you do that with Docker, you can run it as a container. But when you want to deploy it with Kubernetes, you take that container and package it or put it in a vehicle, that is the pod. So the unit of deployment in Kubernetes is a pod. And that's what we are going to start talking about. So let's say we want to deploy these pods in a Kubernetes environments. So how does that work is what we would look at. So let's just consider your application being packaged in the form of a pod. Let's take maybe an example with, let's say, a front-end application or a web server that you have, and along with that you need a database in the backend. So let's just take this example where you start with the application, two-tier application with front-end and DB, and both of these would be packaged as images, and then you would start running those in the pods. That's what we are going to start assuming. Now for the front-end application, you would have to build the image because it's your own application. If it is your own application, you can build an image. But if it is a database, let's say MySQL or Postgres, you can pull the image from the registry. You don't have to build it. Right, so those are also called as a off-the-shelf application. Sometimes COTS being commercial off-the-shelf application. Some of these are open source, so we won't call it as commercial. But these are off-the-shelf applications, so you can pull the images, you can create the containers and run them in a pod. So you construct a pod and you start running them. So when you want to run your application, you may want to run it with high availability. Now, how do you achieve that is where replication controllers play a big part there. And the job of a replication controller is very simple. It has only two tasks that it has to take care of, and it does it well. The first is the replication. Replication is how you decide, hey, I want to run these many instances or replicas of my application, and that's what you define with the replication controller, and it takes care of that. It does the scaling part. A manual scaling, you can define a replica count and it will scale that. Second part is the availability. Availability is important, where replication controller has to monitor for the availability of these pods, and whenever a pod goes down, it is the job of the replication controller to bring it back. So talking to the scheduler and launching a new pod is what it does. So it will constantly, in a loop, keeps on monitoring for the availability of the replicas. Replicas are of a pod. The second thing that you may want to do after this is, hey, how do I go from this version to the next version of my application? In which case you would have built a new image and you want to deploy it. And when you deploy that, you may want to define certain strategy. In Kubernetes environment, the strategies could be rolling updates or batch updates or recreate, in which case you set up a downtime and then you bring up a new version. Now, when you have these pods deployed, the next question could be, how do I send the traffic to these pods? You need to have a way to do that, and that's where services come in. And services act like a load balancer to send, and it accepts the traffic on a certain IPN port and then sends it to the backend pods. And that is the concept of services. It's mainly how you access your application, how you distribute the traffic between all the available pods is what is defined in service. And every service has an IP and a DNS or a name associated with it. So in addition to load balancing, services in Kubernetes also offer you with service discovery, because when one of your application wants to connect to the second application, how does it do that is through this endpoint, a common endpoint it connects to, that's the service, and behind the service would be the pods, and this service is exposed with the DNS, so it can connect using that name. So naming or service discovery is also what services provide. So when you deploy your applications, you'll typically need to create deployments and services. Deployment in turn will manage the replication controller. So that's why we don't talk about replication controllers separately. So replication controllers are part of deployment, and that's how it will look like. So if you have two-tier application, you would create a deployment and a service for your front-end application as well as for the database. And those are the minimum objects that you need to create when you get started deploying your application in a Kubernetes environment.